Welcome to Are You Crazy, a podcast about mental health in Malaysia. I'm your host, Delia Pikri, and well, in this episode, we are going to talk about personal accountability. Now, when you started listening to this sort of podcast about mental health, you probably had this impression that it was going to be all airy fairy, positivity, we can do this sort of stuff, and well, to an extent, you're not wrong. I think that Malaysians tend to be too hard on ourselves and we don't know how to be happy. Maybe it's a whole Asian mindset thing where you're always trying and you're never good enough. So I think there's a lot of value in validating the fact that we need to be kinder to ourselves and we need to be proud of our accomplishments. And I will be fighting to do just that. However, the mental health space isn't always airy fairy bubbliness. Therapy can be hard. Dealing with mental health issues can be hard, and, well, there's a lot of shades of grey and darkness in the space as well. So, on top of the usual airy fairy stuff, I thought today we could delve into the darker aspects of mental health in Malaysia, specifically personal accountability, and more specifically, how just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean that is a good excuse to be a horrible person to others. Let's begin. Now, when I think about this sort of thing in regards to mental health, a few examples come to mind. One of the examples that I can remember is someone telling another friend of mine, giving them a text or maybe giving them a call, saying that if you do not come to where I am right now, I might hurt myself. And I'm being very careful about not triggering anyone here, but while we're here, I do want to put this warning out there. This episode might deal with some sensitive topics, such as suicide mentions or abuse mentions. So if this is something that is an issue to you, I would recommend that you perhaps turn off the episode and maybe come back when you're in a healthier mind space, or you don't have to listen to it at all. Your own mental health is the priority here. But yes, anyway, for this person sent a text to their friends saying that if you don't come to where I am right now, I will be hurting myself. And because of that, you are taking away that other person's choice to decline. And sometimes it can be done in unreasonable hours. I've heard cases of someone threatening to hurt themselves in the middle of the night, 2 to 3 a.m., every single night to the same person, essentially kind of torturing them because they're not able to get a good night's sleep every night because they worry that if they don't respond to that message, then this person might actually go through with hurting themselves. And you're putting way too much responsibility on just one person. That's ridiculous. Or sometimes people use mental illness as an excuse for being horrible to someone else in other ways. If you, for example, have anger issues and when your mental health issues flare up, you start punching your spouse, or you hit someone, or you yell horrible things to someone, and yet when you apologize for it later, you tell that person, hey, I know I did this bad thing to you and I trespassed on your boundaries. You deserve not to get hurt. Unfortunately, I have a mental illness and therefore your personal sense of safety and well-being can be negated for my own personal sense of satisfaction. And that is, well, you wouldn't say it like that. I apologize. I realize that. But that is essentially what you're saying. Just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean you're not accountable to your own actions. That is the thing that I want to put forward, and it's really, really important. And this could even apply in smaller cases. I have seen situations where someone I knew is not friends with the people that she was friends with in childhood anymore, specifically because she kept blaming her not great behavior on her personal traumas. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but she definitely has a reason to be traumatized. Her trauma is absolutely valid. It's not really my place to decide whether it's valid or not, but frankly, she did have a hard life, and I completely understand. And yet, even in friend situations that had nothing to do with her personal trauma, she would make the mistakes, she would fight with her friends, she would say horrible things to her friends, and then later she would apologize. But it was always this backhanded sort of apology, like, look, I'm sorry that I had a lot of trauma in my past. I would bring up this trauma and this trauma and this trauma, and because of that, I did things to hurt you. I'm so sorry for being damaged. You know, that sort of vibe. If you do something wrong to someone, then you need to make up for it. It's not fair to the other person that they have to tiptoe around your issues, but you are able to just kind of go through their boundaries whenever you want without them having a say in it. That's not fair. That's not friendship. And the worst part about it is people who have mental illnesses. This is just a personal observation that I'm making. People with mental illnesses tend to flock with other people with mental illnesses. It's, I guess, birds of a feather flock together, and it's easier to talk about your issues with people who understand. So imagine this scenario where you are consistently pushing someone beyond what they're comfortable with, and yet you are trying to use your mental illness as an excuse, and yet this other person's, your friends and your family's mental illnesses is not a valid reason for them to say, hey, you are infringing upon my right to have my personal safety and comfort respected. So are you trying to imply that your mental illness is more valid than someone else's mental illness? Because that is what happens. Eventually, you chip away at someone's ability to say no, and that is horrible. And in certain situations, abusive, whether physically or emotionally abusive. And I do not stand for that. Hi again. If you're watching this on video, then you likely have noticed that I had to re-record this due to technical difficulties, so that's fun. Anyway, moving back on track. Now, I am hardly the first person to have ever brought this up. Definitely not. And in fact, with that in mind, I would like to bring your attention to this article that I found on the internet. Give me a second. Called No, Mental Illness and Trauma Don't Excuse Us from Accountability, written by B.B. Buchanan. Now, this article was actually written in regards to accountability in the mental health advocacy space or the mental health support space. So, with that context, I'd like to read you a short excerpt from it and then later kind of jump around in the article to give my little take on a few things mentioned here and there. So let's begin. Trauma and mental illness do not abdicate you from responsibility for your relationship with others, said the article. Too rarely do we discuss mental health and trauma in our movement spaces. That said, when it is talked about, there are some common tropes or standard ways of talking about disability and trauma that fail to both make space for disability and hold the community members accountable. By reproducing these standard frames around disability, we open up the space for abuse and toxicity with no recourse for justice, restorative or otherwise. The article continues to say, as someone who participates in movement spaces and who carries around our mental illness and trauma, I want us as a community to sit down and really think about the ways in which we must hold space for disability and accountability. Now, the first thing that they brought up is, quote unquote, your feelings are valid. Now, I don't want to diminish the power of this phrase. Like I said, I tend to think that Malaysians especially do not tend to honor how we feel, or at the very least try not to honor how we feel. And that is a problem. Here's the thing, even if your feelings are irrational, you absolutely have the right to feel them. when we give ourselves permission to feel feelings, that finally allows us to move towards addressing it and solving the issue behind the feelings. And yet, at the same time, we still have to acknowledge that these feelings aren't rational. Like, well, I'm not trying to say that all feelings aren't rational, but there are some feelings that are more rational than others. For example, let's use the example of someone who is traumatized by loud noises. Because of that, let's just say there are fireworks going off on the outside. This person might start feeling panic and fear in reaction to the loud noises, even though they understand that a fear of fireworks is irrational. Now, they need to understand that their feeling of fear is valid, but at the same time, understand that their response to the fear, response to the noise is perhaps not. And that really leads to accountability, I think, because while you have a right to feel all your feelings, positive, negative, everything in between, rational, irrational, you are still responsible for how you respond to your feelings. Now, to kind of pivot back to the example of the abusive partner, you maybe have anger management issues, and that's understandable. Not all of us learned how to deal with our anger, and so certain situations might trigger an angry response. Now, that is perfectly acceptable, and you have a responsibility to understand why you feel that way, and yet how you respond to that feeling matters. You could A, scream and shout, or B, start breaking things, or C, lash out against people who may not deserve it, or B, you could acknowledge that anger, understand why it's happening, or even if you don't understand why it's happening just yet, decide to step away from the situation, go to another place, and make sure that if you do end up screaming or shouting or lashing out, that no one else is around to be victim to your outburst. Now, that I think is an important distinction because, like I said, if you decide to go somewhere else to scream, even though you are still screaming and that might not be the best way to deal with your particular anger issues, it's still a positive way to learn how to process your emotions, even if you're not quite perfect at it yet, without making others the victim. This is what I mean by accountability. So, feelings are valid, yes. How you respond to them is absolutely your responsibility, and you need to take charge of how you feel and what your mental illness makes you do. And other stuff in the article is kind of talks about stuff that we've already discussed. For example, I have quote insert trauma or disability, thus I cannot be harmful, which I hope I've illustrated is absolutely false. Just because you have trauma doesn't mean that you now get to inflict trauma on others. And the thing is, it's a bit of a sad situation because usually if you get to the point of trauma, that is because someone or something has hurt you. And yet, because of that, you now feel like you can expand the radius of damage from just you to other people. I don't think that is valid. Other people are not responsible for your trauma, unfortunately. Which is why I thought of phrasing this in terms of personal responsibility, because while you should, and you can, and absolutely should be asking for help, other people are not responsible for how you respond to your trauma. There's this idea that I have kind of grown attached to called intergenerational trauma, where sometimes there is a situation where you, while being raised by your parents, perhaps went through certain emotional or physical abuse that you never knew was bad because it's all you've ever known. And it wasn't healthy, but because you don't know any better, you are now inflicting that particular abuse to your children. And then your children might internalize that and inflict that particular abuse on their children, on and on and on and on, causing an intergenerational damage that passes from mother to daughter to son to grandson over and over and over and over again. And there, while I was reading up about intergenerational trauma, I found out that as long as you are mindful and aware of the particular things that caused you trauma in the first place, you absolutely can prevent yourself from passing on that trauma to your kids. And I think the same principle applies to this topic as well in terms of mental illness and responsibility. What I'm trying to say is, do not be a bomb that explodes, and while exploding and hurting yourself, hurts others. Now, why did I bring this up? Well, first thing, I brought it up for the people who might currently be victims to someone who is using their mental illness as an excuse to chip away at your ability to say no. And that is an awful situation to be in, and I just want to let you know that just because someone you love, either a friend or family or something like that, or even a partner, has a mental illness, doesn't mean that you are not allowed to have your own boundaries. No matter what relationship you're in, family, again, whatever, you have a right to feel safe and you have a right to feel comfortable in the relationship. And if, let's just say, this person refuses to change, regardless of how much you've tried to help them, and you've tried to be there for them, but still you feel your sense of safety and comfort chipping away, there is absolutely nothing wrong with cutting them out of your life, I think. It's really important. You do not deserve to carry someone else's mental abuse and then get abused yourself. That's just not how this thing works. And the second reason that I brought this up is for people who may have a mental illness and be unknowingly causing mental health detriment to other people, aka the kind of people that I may be calling out in this podcast right now. So if you happen to be that person, I just want to start by saying that I'm sorry that whatever happened caused you to feel traumatized in the first place. It's an awful situation to be in, and I understand that maybe feeling that way makes you feel like you want to lash out against the people because the world isn't fair. Why do I have to suffer by myself? And I wouldn't say that that was my thought process specifically, but I kind of admit that I used to be one of these people who didn't know how to deal with my emotions and unfortunately caused a lot of pain for other people by screaming or shouting at them when they didn't deserve it. So, been there, done that. So maybe speaking from a place of experience, I could give you a little advice regarding this. So, this is not gonna be accessible to everyone, I understand, but if you can, you should absolutely try to get therapy or see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, whatever suits your particular situation, right? Because here's the thing. The reason you ended up being the sort of person is perhaps because you can't face how you feel and it's easier for you to deflect. So if you found someone who could help you navigate these emotions, then maybe you'll be able to work through it in a safe and healthy sort of way. Now, again, this is completely not reasonable for everyone, completely understand. If you happen to be in university or school, there's probably a counselor you could see for free or cheap at the very least. That is also an option. But if you don't have access to that, I would really encourage you to buy books or go online and read articles about any issue that you have, especially articles that are endorsed by psychologists or psychiatrists or etc. etc. If you go to a therapist, you would be able to get more targeted help for your issues, so it might move a little faster or it might move, more efficiently. But if that's not accessible, you can absolutely read about your issues online and learn how to solve it. I know that I definitely went to therapy to get help. I also see a psychiatrist every now and again, but at the same time, I feel like I also learn a lot by reading up about psychology and how the brain works and emotions and stuff on the internet by myself. And I think both in marriage helped me. So if I didn't have the help of a therapist, I think I'd still get better just by being curious about this sort of thing and reading up about it online. That is an option. Another option that I would recommend is also to join internet support groups. There's lots of them on Facebook, I would say, or even Reddit, depending on what issue that you have. Now, not all support spaces are made equal. I just want to put out that warning. Depending on who moderates the space, you might end up being in a toxic community. So, just to make sure that I'm being responsible here, when you look out for support groups, do so with a grain of salt. If you feel like something's off or if you're not comfortable there, no harm in leaving. It's okay because the point of a support group is to give you support. So, make sure you actually feel supported there. Now, the next thing I want to bring up in terms of healing is making reparations. So, we're talking about this in terms of damaging other people, right? So, as much as possible, try to make amends for whatever you did before. Sometimes the people you've hurt before would have just liked to know that their experiences were real and that they absolutely had a right to feel upset if they were upset. So, doing so might help them. At the same time, you should also be aware that since in this situation you have hurt them, they are allowed their response to you. So if they refuse to engage with you or if they respond negatively, you kind of have to take it because they have a right to feel that way. And so while I highly encourage making amends if possible, at the same time, make sure that you are at an emotional space where if they do respond negatively, you do not end up lashing out against them and then just repeating the cycle all over again. And speaking of repeating the cycle, the next step that I would recommend is learning to accept what you did before, learn the lessons that you can learn from the situation, and try to move on being a better person. Now, it might seem a bit counterproductive to say this in a podcast about accountability, yet, here's the thing. Let's recall when you were doing your perhaps abusive or toxic tendencies. When you were doing it, it was probably born out of stress, right? So if you take accountability as a reason to stress yourself out, you're pretty much just making it more likely that you do it yet again. So learn as much as you can, but don't carry this stress around you with you so that you can make sure that you don't inflict this again on other people. And try to learn as much as you can, move on, and go to the next step. And another thing that I want to say is give yourself space to learn and make sure you have coping skills in place so that while you're learning, you can try to avoid as much damage to other people as possible. The example I brought up in terms of anger comes to mind. Now, when you have angry feelings, for example, you may not necessarily be able to control yourself from throwing a tantrum, for example, but if you could somehow learn to give yourself space in between feeling angry and lashing out, you can absolutely remove yourself from the situation and go have your tantrum somewhere that is safe. And this is a great skill to have in the meantime while you're learning how to control your emotions and address the cause of your anger. Now, I use anger as an example, perhaps because that's what I personally struggled with, but you could do this with any other emotion. Just, try to figure out any way to remove yourself from the situation or temporarily allow yourself to feel your feelings in a way that removes you from the space where you will hurt others. Sometimes you may have to limit interactions with people who might be your trigger temporarily. Just let them know that this is a thing and that you're doing this to improve your relationship with them, and then take your time. Well, I think I said a bit more than I intended to here, but we're just gonna leave that in because a podcast is nothing if not raw. So, before I reveal anything else about myself, I think now is the time to end this particular episode. To everyone listening here today, I wish you a lot of healing energy, and I really hope that tomorrow will be better for you, brain wise, than yesterday. Thank you for listening, and I will see you again in the next episode. Bye!